Welcome. Let's begin. Today I'm going to be reading from a little book that I've had since the 80s. It's called The Significance of Mary for Women. I'm not sure if this little book can still be found anywhere, but I will be reading it for you here. I may cut this in a few videos because it's a few pages long, and it may be too much to sit and hear it all at once. So let's get into it. The significance of Mary for women. Mary, it has frequently been said, is the conqueror of all heresies. What that means, in part at least, is that a correct understanding of Mary safeguards a correct understanding of other church teachings. Certainly, that has been especially true in the past with regard to two of the most important areas of the Catholic faith, namely Christology and ecclesiology. With regard to Christology, for example, Mary's most important title in the Church, Mother of God, was affirmed by the 5th century councils of Ephesus and Chalcedon by way of safeguarding our faith that Christ is both human, hence Mary is genuinely his mother, and divine in the unity of the person of the Son of God. Hence, she is not just mother of Jesus, but mother of God. With regard to ecclesiology, we have long recognized that what is said of Mary is generally said also of the Church. Hence, just as Mary is mother, so is the Church. Just as Mary bore Christ into the world, so does the Church. Just as Mary mediates Christ to us, so does the Church. So important is Mary's identification with the Church that Vatican II chose not to issue a separate document on Mary, but to include her within Lumen Gentium. Pope John Paul II's encyclical on Mary, Redemptoris Mater, also identifies Mary with the life of the Pilgrim Church. Her role in this regard is strikingly summarized in a single passage of the document where John Paul II notes, and this is a quote from him, "It is precisely Mary's faith which marks the beginning of the new and eternal covenant of God with man in Jesus Christ. This heroic faith of hers precedes the apostolic witness of the Church and ever remains in the Church's heart, hidden like a special heritage of God's revelation. All those who from generation to generation accept the apostolic witness of the Church shares in the mysterious inheritance and, in a sense, share in Mary's faith." End quote. This passage is particularly important for two reasons. First, the Pope identifies the inauguration of the new covenant with Mary's fiat, thereby underscoring the fact that the covenant brought fully into existence by Christ's death on the cross is not solely his work, but also involves the complementary and cooperation of the, quote, woman. And they mention this in John chapter 2, verse 4, and chapter 19, verse 26 through 27. Second, the Pope points out that Mary's journey of faith precedes the apostolic witness of the Church and is shared by all who respond to that witness. In so doing, the Pope suggests that Mary's non-apostolic role, in the strict sense of the term, not only precedes, but also in some sense provides that necessary foundation for such witness. Those sent out to baptize all nations do so for the purpose of drawing all of humanity back in to the heart, that is, the faith of the Church, which is in reality a share in Mary's faith. But in what sense does this encyclical shed light on the special significance of Mary with regard to women in particular? When we turn to Redemptoris Mater, We find that this encyclical does indeed address the special importance which Mary's role in salvation has for women. Therefore, we shall take up first what the Pope has to say about the special significance of Mary in particular and of women in general. Second, why it is that the female plays this special role in the new covenant. And third, what bearing this has on women, especially Catholic women, in today's society. So the next topic is Mary and women, the importance of motherhood. While we are now well accustomed to hearing about the faith Mary has in God and how that faith serves as a model for all disciples, male and female, the Pope does not stop there. He goes on to make an extraordinary observation about God's relationship to Mary. First, he notes that the Church places great trust in Mary. And then he adds, and this is a quote from his book, "For it must be recognized that before anyone else, it was God himself, the eternal Father, who entrusted himself to the Virgin of Nazareth, giving her his own Son in the mystery of the Incarnation." End quote. The eternal Father entrusted his Son to Mary. This perspective is enormously important since it enables us to view Mary's relationship to Christ in a new light and to see in that part of her journey whereby Mary precedes the Church some obvious yet heretofore imperfectly recognized elements of that relationship. First, by her fiat, Mary undertakes to carry within her this child who is both God's Son and hers for those 9 months from conception to birth, when every child is entirely dependent on his mother's care and protection. Furthermore, Mary's role as a mediatrix properly begins here at her son's conception, since in these first 9 months of his incarnate life, she mediates to him, literally through her own body, all that he is able to learn during that time of the larger world into which he will eventually be born. And once born, he will still look to her, especially in those early years, which are formative for all children, to continue to mediate that world to him. Second, during the first several years of his life, Christ must depend on Mary in a way that she cannot as yet depend on him. Nothing makes this clearer than the flight into Egypt. Mary cannot call upon Christ's strength during this dangerous time, for it is the Christ child himself who stands in need of hers. As Father John H. Miller has pointed out, the grown-up Jesus wasn't there to hold her hand and give her moral support. Only an infant was in her arms to be cared for and protected. Finally, in entrusting his son to her, the Father entrusts to her the task of raising him up into the kind of man upon whom our salvation can safely rest. As Scripture twice notes, a mother is charged with bearing, not a child, but a man into the world. Genesis chapter 4, verse 1, and John chapter 16, verse 21. As I have noted elsewhere, motherhood is not, as we might say today, simply biological. It is more than just conceiving and giving birth to a child. It has to do with raising that child up to adulthood, and that responsibility has always been seen as lying much more with mothers than with fathers. Both Eve and Mary are rightly viewed as bearing men into the world. Did Mary prove trustworthy? Here we have the testimony not of the Father who entrusted the Son, but of the Son himself, who at the culmination of his hour from the cross entrusts to her his fledgling church. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing near, he said to his mother, "Woman, behold your son." Then he said to the disciple, "Behold your mother." And from that hour, the disciple took her to his own home. John chapter 19, verse 26 through 27. It is significant that the beloved disciple, who stands for the community of believers, is entrusted to Mary before Mary is entrusted to him. And as the Pope points out, quoting Pope John Paul II again, he says, "The Redeemer entrusts Mary to John because he entrusts John to Mary. At the foot of the cross, there begins that special entrusting of humanity to the Mother of Christ, which in the history of the Church has been practiced and expressed in different ways." End quote. This theme of entrusting is, in the Pope's encyclical, important for the light it sheds on Mary's role in the life of her son and in the mission of the Church. But it is also important for the light it sheds on the role women in general are called to play in the lives of their children and in the mission of the Church. For it is precisely as the one to whom God entrusted his son that the Pope sees Mary as illuminating the value and significance of the female. Quoting John Paul II again, "The figure of Mary of Nazareth sheds light on womanhood as such by the very fact that God, in the sublime event of the incarnation of his Son, entrusted himself to the ministry, the free and active ministry of a woman." End quote. Next, we go on to entrusting, the essence of motherhood. So why does the Pope identify entrusting as that which defines the importance not only of Mary, but also of women in general? First, the Pope stresses the fact that Mary's vocation is defined by her motherhood. As he puts it, Mary's motherhood constitutes the first and fundamental dimension of the mediation which the Church confesses and proclaims in her regard. Second, the Pope takes up the meaning of motherhood itself. According to him, and this is a quote, "Of the essence of motherhood is the fact that it concerns the person. Motherhood always establishes a unique and unrepeatable relationship between two people, between mother and child, and between child and mother." End quote. It is precisely because motherhood establishes a relationship between the mother and the child, which is unique and unrepeatable, that Mary's role in salvation can be characterized as special and extraordinary. As his mother, she enjoys a relationship with Christ which cannot be duplicated in the life of anyone else. At the same time, however, and according to the Pope, her role as mother to whom this child and later the beloved disciple would be entrusted tells us what entrusting means. As John Paul II puts it, such entrusting is the response to a person's love, and in particular to the love of a mother. To say that God entrusted his son to her is to say that he entrusted his son to the love which Mary would give precisely as his mother. And to say that Christ entrusted all of humanity to her is to say that he has entrusted us to the love which Mary continues to give as a mother. It is remarkable to think of both the Father and the Son entrusting themselves to this woman, but beyond that, the Pope's identification of motherhood with entrusting is extraordinary from another point of view, for it raises a very interesting question for us. If entrusting has to do with the response to a person's love, why does the Pope specify that person as a mother? Why not identify that person either as a father, namely the eternal Father himself, who so loved the world that he gave his only son? A quote from John chapter 3, verse 16. Or as Christ, who willingly underwent crucifixion out of love for us. The value and significance of Mary in particular, and of women in general, lies, I think, in the answer to that twofold question. Why is it that entrusting does not, at least in its most basic form, refer to the relationship which exists between a father and a child, or more specifically, between the eternal Father in heaven and his children here on earth? To put it another way, what is the difference between fatherhood and motherhood, which requires that we identify entrusting more with the love of a mother than with the love of a father? The answer, I believe, lies in the difference between the distancing which is implied by fatherhood as contrasted with the immediacy which is associated with motherhood. As Walter Ong notes in his work on male consciousness, Fighting for Life, I quote him, masculinity stands in the human psyche of a kind of otherness, a difference, end quote. For that reason, Ong observes with regard to God, and this is a quote out of his book, Fighting for Life, he is likened to the masculine not because he has a masculine physical constitution, but because he is a source of existence that is other, different, separated. Kadosh, the Hebrew word translated sanctus hagios, holy, means at root separated from all his creation, even from human beings, though they are made in his image and likeness, end quote. This otherness or difference is, of course, related to the fact that God is by nature pure spirit, whereas we are embodied or material beings. But distance, or so it would seem in some fashion, defines the Father, since even when God becomes human or embodied, it is not the Father who comes in person, but the Son who is sent by the Father. The Father who sins remains, to some degree at least, in the distance. Motherhood, on the other hand, is never directly attributed to God, but only to human beings. Indeed, both Eve and Mary would seem in some fashion to be defined in their very being as mothers. Eve as mother of all living, we see that in Genesis chapter 3, verse 20, and Mary as mother of God. The revelation would indicate that the fullness of motherhood is properly found in women, whereas the fullness of fatherhood is found only in God. Matthew chapter 23, verse 9 says, "Call no man your father on earth, for you have one Father who is in heaven." The fullness of motherhood found in Mary corresponds to the fullness of fatherhood found not in Joseph, but in God the Father. The reason motherhood belongs properly to the creature rather than the creator seems clear. For as Carl Stern, a psychiatrist and convert to Catholicism, has noted, quote, "Woman in her being is deeply committed to bios, to nature itself. The words for mother and mater or mater and materia are etymologically related," end quote. The statement, "the Father sent the Son," refers to that moment when the Son became incarnate. The Father sent the Son is simply another way of saying that the Father entrusted his Son to the materia or materiality of his creation in the only way he could be entrusted, by way of a mater or a mother. Indeed, while it is true that Mary is unique because to her God entrusted his only begotten Son, the fact remains that God entrusts to a mother every child he creates. For mothers provide the only entrance any child has into this world. Human fathers, on the other hand, necessarily share, to some degree, in the distance which separates God the Father from each human child. As Ong has pointed out, and this is a quote from his book again, among higher forms of life, above the egg-laying species, the male's physical relationship to his offspring is distinctively distanced. The male reproductive cell becomes effectively reproductive when it is totally detached from the male's body and joins the cell that, in the higher forms of life, remains attached to the female. Fathers are essentially distant from offspring physically. They can even be dead and buried when the child is being formed and is born, end quote. Because motherhood is bound up with materiality per se, the Pope is quite right to see Mary's fiat as the moment in which the new covenant is inaugurated. For what distinguishes the new covenant from the old is, above all, the immediacy of God's presence among us from within the created material order itself. In this sense, the Old Testament is properly symbolized by the male patriarchs and prophets, while the New is best symbolized by Mary herself. For as Stern notes, and this is a quote, The prophetic, all that which points towards the incarnation, is the male. In the Hebrew liturgy, the patriarchs are invoked as the Blessed Virgin is in the Christian. The remote foreknowledge of that which one will neither see nor touch is the patrial. And it is with the incarnation as an historical fact that the Blessed Virgin becomes the prototype of faith. Here, contrary to the faith of the prophets, faith achieves the immediacy of certitude in that carnal link with being which is at the core of all womanhood. End quote. Motherhood lies at the center of the new covenant because the Father entrusts his Son to a mother. But in point of fact, and as noted earlier, God entrusts every child of his making to a mother. Each of us, by our very creation, is forced, as it were, to trust the mother to whom God has entrusted us. As Stern has observed, the paradox of being human resides in the fact that while we are the summit of God's creation, each one of us must, in order to enter this life, pass through a period of utter helplessness and dependence. We must trust our mothers for the simple reason that we are given literally no alternatives. For that reason alone, as Stern points out, faith grows out of the relation of child and mother. Father, whether divine or human, lies off in the distance, beyond mother. If our relationship with God the Father does not supply the most basic instance of entrusting, it is because we are material beings who must first be entrusted to a mother before there is any possibility of our coming to know our Father, whether human or divine. And for the same reason, of course, our relationship with Christ also cannot supply the most basic instance of entrusting, inasmuch as we must also necessarily trust our mothers before we are in a position to entrust ourselves to Christ. We must, in other words, be born of flesh and blood before we can be born of water and the Spirit. No one can enter into the new covenant by way of baptism who has not first entered into the world by way of a woman. But what about the importance of motherhood within the new covenant? Given the fact that the Son was sent precisely that he might mediate God to us in the material immediacy of his own humanity, surely no further material mediation is required. Surely, within the order of grace, entrusting ourselves to the love of Christ is the most basic instance of entrusting we now experience. Surely Christ, the one mediator between God and man, does not himself require further mediation. As plausible as this might sound, it is not, of course, the position of the Church, not of Pope John Paul II. Mary remains mother to us in the order of grace and entrusting, even within the new covenant, according to John Paul II. He continues to find its most basic expression in response to a mother's rather than to Christ's love. Why this should be so brings us, I think, to the core of the role the female is called to play in our salvation. A child is entrusted to a mother for two basic reasons. First, because vulnerably and dependent, the child's survival depends upon his mother, always in those months between conception and birth, and for most children in the first few years after birth. Second, a child is entrusted to a mother in order that he might, through her, come to know the larger world into which he must himself someday go. Motherhood is, in the strictest sense of the word, mediation, for mothers are always called to point their children beyond themselves, not only spatically into the world and relationally into the community of other people, but also temporally into the maturity of adulthood. Women are called to bear men and women into the world. Mothers are therefore the first and generally the most influential guide children are given in this world. Children are entrusted to mothers in order that mothers might enable children to entrust themselves to others, initially their fathers, and of course ultimately their eternal Father. And since not all people or things are trustworthy, children also depend on their mothers to inform them of and protect them from anyone or anything which might harm them. The child is entrusted to his mother in order that he might know beyond her what can and cannot be trusted. Although mothers may not have the power to command enjoyed by fathers, they are the primary mediators of reality in a child's life. Mothers, it might therefore be said, stand for the realm of trust first, in the sense that the survival of children depends primarily on the trustworthiness of mothers, and second, in the sense that mothers, more than any other person in our lives, are expected to be able to distinguish beyond themselves what can be trusted from what cannot. Indeed, in a larger sense, the female per se would seem to stand for the realm of trust. This, at least, would appear to be the reason why, back in the Garden of Eden, the serpent approaches Eve rather than Adam. For the serpent, as John Paul II points out in Redemptoris Mater, is the father of lies, who sows suspicion in the heart of Eve. The serpent's intent is to direct her trust away from God's command and towards his own interpretation of that command. She is seduced into concluding that the serpent is more to be trusted than God, and Adam clearly relies on her judgment to his grief and ours. Mary, the new Eve, provides the antithesis to Eve's refusal. As John Paul II notes, quote, in contrast with the suspicion which the father of lies sowed in the heart of Eve, the first woman, Mary, whom tradition is wont to call the new Eve and the true mother of the living, boldly proclaims the undimmed truth about God, the holy and almighty God, who from the beginning is the source of all gifts, he who has done great things in her as well as in the whole universe, end quote. Mary, because she entrusted herself to the truth of God, was herself trustworthy. Hence, the Father was able to entrust his only Son to her. Mary's fiat, however, was not an end in itself, but was directed ultimately to the Son being able to entrust humanity to her as our mother in the order of grace. For as the Pope points out, the entrusting of a child to Mary began with Christ, but was ultimately for the sake of pointing others to Christ. Quote, this filial relationship, this self-entrusting of a child to its mother, not only has its beginning in Christ, but can also be said to be definitively directed toward him. Mary can be said to continue to say to each individual the words which she spoke at Cana in Galilee, do whatever he tells you, end quote. All of the great philosophers of the world have sought the truth of things, and because they have identified truth with abstract knowledge, they have sought to reason their way to it. In so doing, they have bypassed the female. For abstract knowledge is neither personal nor material. It is abstract precisely because it has detached itself from both. And abstractions, as Karl Rahner observed, require no mother. Christ, on the other hand, tells us that he is the truth, not, mind you, that he has the truth, but that he is the truth. The truth, therefore, the ultimate truth of things, is neither impersonal nor immaterial, and for this reason the truth does require a mother. By the same token, reason is not sufficient to bring us to the truth, for in the final analysis, truth in the person of Jesus Christ requires not just that we recognize it, not just that we make use of it as we would of abstract knowledge, but that we surrender ourselves to it. We are called to entrust ourselves to Christ. And how is such entrusting possible? Reason alone does not suffice, for reason alone produces only impersonal knowledge. What we require is a different kind of knowledge, the kind of knowledge which arises not out of abstract reasoning, but out of the intimacy of personal relationship. This knowledge, connatural as opposed to rational, is essential if we are to recognize the truth of Jesus Christ. And, as Stern points out, knowledge by connaturality originates in the child-mother relationship. Mary is our most reliable guide to Christ. The Son is the best positioned to attest to the truth of Christ, precisely because she is his mother. She knows him as no one else among us possibly can. And because God was able to entrust his only Son to her, her Son has been able to entrust us to her guidance. When Mary counsels every one of us to do whatever he tells you, she is assuring us that we can entrust ourselves to him. By so doing, she is inviting every one of us to do what is, in the created order, the supremely female thing, namely to surrender ourselves to another. As Stern has noted, quote, a woman's love, that divine surrender of her ultra inner being, which the impassioned woman makes, is perhaps the only thing which is not achieved by reasoning, end quote. If Christ is the truth, then Mary is the trust. And the truth, because personal and material, cannot be efficacious in our world unless we entrust ourselves to him. For that reason, Christ requires the female mediation of his mother. For only a mother can offer us the assurance we require, that we not only can believe what he says, but can also safely entrust ourselves to the person he is. For that reason, Mary's motherhood can be said to extend to all of humanity, and all of humanity requires the assurance of this woman who is uniquely the mother of God. The Pope, however, and as we have seen, insists that all women share in this ministry which Christ has entrusted to Mary. What concretely does this mean for women today? What are women especially called to do? And we will get into that in the second part of this, going through the significance of Mary for women. Thank you for listening to the first half of this little book, and we'll pick it up there tomorrow. Y'all have a blessed day. Goodbye.